right, so good morning, good afternoon, depending on when you'll be watching this, or good evening. But I wanted to go ahead and just record the lecture for the Cortex that we'll be using in the course, because for some classes in which they would receive this lecture on Thursday, September 3rd, I will be at like an orientation type thing for my daughter's second grade. And so I will be unable to be on live to do the lecture. I'm going to pop in for everybody at the start of the class just to let them know that the lectures have been pre-recorded for today, because I had to be there for her second grade meet and greet type thing. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started and do the Cortex lecture first, because that's most important. You'll find this lecture on Blackboard under the course content. If you hit the lecture slides, I substitute the title that they had and just made it much shorter and just said lecture slides. And that's where you'll find all of the lectures for the course, but in particular the one that says Introduction to Text. And that will have the content that will go over the 3 books that I assigned for you all for the course. If you recall, are W.E.B. Du Bois' The Soul of Black Folks, then as well the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and then also the narrative of Equiano. Okay, and so they are already available to you. You don't have to purchase the books. As I said, I think in our first lecture, you don't have to purchase the books. Okay, you can go to Project Gutenberg. The links I've provided you in Blackboard and the announcements, as well as under the assigned readings, and you can just click through the links, and it has all of the text, full text there for you. You can even download them to your computer if you like. If you don't even want to have to worry about using the links, you can go to Project Gutenberg and download the copies to your flash drive, to your hard drive, whatever, and then actually have them. So you can do that, and then you'll have the text. I know some people inquired if they needed to buy them. You don't, but if you would like to buy it, that's fine. But they are available there for you, and you can find again the assignment for the week 1 readings, not week 1, but for the first reading set of readings is W.E.B. Du Bois' The Soul of Black Folks, Chapter 2. And so I went ahead and assigned readings and put the first assignment there. I'll also post it probably in the announcements, but if you would like to get started with the reading, we don't have any official assignments this week, okay? So no discussion board is due, because registration is still open at the university until Friday. So I didn't want people to be added into the course or courses, depending on what section you're in, and then be late because they missed the deadline for the discussion board. So we won't begin the discussion boards until next week. So there is no assignment. There are no assignments for this week, but the reading requirement that'll be due in week 4, that's when we'll discuss it. I went ahead and gave it to you, so if you do want something to do, if you have time, you can start doing the reading for The Souls of Black Folk. And as I said, I'm going to assign excerpts from all 3 texts throughout the course. So we're not reading all the books in their entirety. We're just reading the different chapters that I assign as we go through the course. Okay, so today I just want to give you a very general overview of what each of these texts are about, and so you have an idea of what it is we'll be looking for as we read them, and then get a sense for how we can connect what is covered in these texts, in these books, to what we see happening in the world today. So if you open the PowerPoint so you can follow along while you're listening to this lecture, the Cortex Introduction PowerPoint, it just tells you the text that we'll be using, and then why they're significant, or the things that you should pay attention to. So if you go past the slide 1, which is basically just the cover. Okay, the first text that I'm talking about, because we'll be reading it first, is The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And the core thing that I want you to get from this text when we think about what it actually did, well, it's really a history of Black people in America. In particular, it takes us through, the times in which slaves were brought to America. Most people, if you're familiar with 1619, there are such a great conference that Norfolk State has put on about 1619 and the arrival of Black Americans to Point Comfort as the first Africans in this country. And Du Bois does a great job of helping us understand how that positioned and structured Black Americans to function, not only as just second-class citizens, but to be seen as other, to be marginalized, to not be given any basic rights of humanity, of life. And so we have in the text Du Bois helping us to understand that after slavery is abolished, that doesn't mean the impact of slavery somehow disappears. And that's something that I want to bring out, because unfortunately, even today, you'll hear people say, well, that was years ago, even centuries ago, let it go. Well, the problem with that type of mentality is that when we say, oh, that happened years ago, let it go, is that we fail to recognize that Black Americans are still suffering, or Black people are still suffering in this country as a result of slavery. And slavery so disenfranchises, it so diminishes and dehumanizes Black people that there is no simple fix. And that means that even if slavery is abolished as it was, that means even if we have social justice movements, which we have, we still see, right, entrenched into the fabric of American society, the issues that are pertinent to racism, to injustice, to prejudice, to discrimination. So I want you to read this work, or the excerpts that I assign, with the understanding that what Du Bois is helping the readers to do, and this work was published in 1903, so basically at the turn of the century, but what Du Bois is helping readers to understand is like, look, this is a long and storied history for Black people in America that is rife with systemic racism, institutionalized inequities. Is basically a condition, right? The Souls of Black Folk is a title, right? When we think about the condition of Blacks in the United States, it's never really been positive, if we're to be honest. And although there may be events that occur historically, like the abolition of slavery, like different organizations that are formed, like the Freedmen's Bureau and some other entities to basically try to help and support Blacks, even if they're formed by whites, there is no one stroke of a pen solution that will fix what has happened as a result of slavery. And so Du Bois proposed a solution for Black Americans through ideological changes and social uplift. And one of the kind of staunch figures of opposition to Du Bois was that of Booker T. Washington. And I know I'm not going to get into here now, because this is just the introductory lecture. I'll go into this more once we start talking about the book. But, it's interesting because, when we think about the veneration, if you will, of Booker T. Washington, many do not necessarily recognize, and I'm not going to say many, but there are quite a few people that don't understand how divisive Booker T. Washington was as a figure, and the challenges that many brought to, his perspective and thoughts about how Black Americans can achieve, I don't even want to say equality, but just achieve a sense of humanity, of rights in society. Many have, in modern times, many scholars have said basically Booker T. Washington was very self-focused and benefited a lot individually from some of the theories about how Black Americans can best achieve socioeconomic growth and development in the country. And he encouraged kind of a work towards equality mindset, that if Black Americans just work hard enough, they'll be accepted. And what Du Bois basically points out, that there is no amount of working hard enough that would basically prevent Black Americans from being under the control and submission of white America. So learning a trade, a skill, and working might provide you some economic, gains. However, that won't necessarily uproot and destabilize the systems of oppression in this country. So Du Bois and Washington very much opposed in their mindsets and viewpoints. And what we'll see when we read Du Bois's writing is that his prose essay really raises objections to and for Black people about how to navigate their injustice. So he really resists waiting for whites to see blacks as equal if we assimilate fully into society. So if we work hard and perform these kind of labor-based trade skills and jobs and do our best to be upstanding moral citizens, that does in no way guarantee that we'll be seen as equal to whites or that our station in American society will change. Du Bois really encouraged an awakening to the negative ideologies, in particular of the Christian church, that in some ways affirmed the systems of oppression held in society, that encouraged black inferiority and servitude. And Du Bois also pointed out that we have to understand how the history of slavery in America was unethical, immoral, and generationally damaging for blacks in the past, present, and future. So Du Bois had a great understanding that the implications of slavery were long-standing, and so that was not something that any law, any proclamation, any one piece of legislation was going to be able to fix. And so as we read a couple chapters from this particular work, I hope you will begin to see the parallels between what Du Bois is arguing and what we see still being argued today in terms of how to eradicate systemic injustice and systemic oppression and all these other forms of social ills that really plague blacks in this country. Now, the other two texts that we will cover in the course are slave narratives. And slave narrative as a genre is a story that recounts the life of an enslaved person, typically covering their experiences and ultimate escape to freedom. So it talks about their experiences in captivity or being enslaved, and then how they usually typically transition in some way, shape, or form into a position of freedom or liberation. It was the main form, or one of the main forms, of African American literature in the 1800s during the slavery and freedom period. And there are many different slave narratives by men, slave narratives by women. There are even collections of slave narratives that you can read that talks about the experiences of different blacks as chattel slaves in this country. And so Frederick Douglass's Frederick Douglass's The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass was published in 1845, and in it Douglass recounts his childhood as a slave and how he finally escaped to freedom, discovers literacy and education as a means to both literal and mental freedom. So what we'll see as we read Douglass is that Douglass kind of takes us on a journey of understanding what types of trauma he experienced as a child, as a slave, and then ultimately through learning to read, how that allowed him to navigate not just through his literal freedom or ability to break away from slavery's clutches, but also then how he was able to open his mind to see just the true condition of slaves in America, and the significance of fighting not just for his own freedom, but the freedom of all blacks that were enslaved. And then we had the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, published in 1789. So it's a slave narrative, but it's also kind of like a travel type slave narrative, captivity narrative, much earlier than Douglass's work. It talks about Equiano's journey, particularly as a sailor, and how he in many ways evolved and developed a sense of self through his experiences as a black man. And so we'll read those two narratives to help us to get kind of a comparative analysis of the different things that they bring, to do a comparative analysis of the different items that each of these narratives bring out. And then I'm also going to add excerpts from a third slave narrative from a black woman, so that you can get one more perspective. I didn't want to assign that particular text, but I will probably in our discussion boards, once we have had a chance to read a little bit of Equiano and a little bit of Douglass, I'm also going to provide excerpts for you to respond to on the Blackboard discussion from a slave narrative of a female. And I just haven't decided which slave narrative that I'm going to choose. There are many that I could choose, but I am going to try to also provide some excerpts for you to respond to, so that you can hear the experiences also of black women who were in slavery, and kind of fold all of those in to help us to get a perspective at least of not only what these experiences were, but also when we think about what Du Bois is talking about, the long-standing effects and impact of slavery in the United States, of the issue of the color line, which is probably one of the most iconic phrases that we'll see people quote from the Souls of Black Folk. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And so this idea, this divide, this delineation between white and black is going to be a source of so much turmoil and tragedy and trauma. And indeed it is true. And I would argue the problem of the 21st century in which we're living is the problem of the color line still in this nation. And so to think about how valuable Du Bois's commentary is, considering what we see happening now, that's really significant. So this is just an introduction. I encourage you to read through or look at the slides to see kind of the information that I just provided to you now. And note, as I said when I did the lecture on Tuesday, when we're doing responses to these works, I'm looking for meaningful reflection, meaningful dialogue. So when I give you a quote and ask you to let me know what your thoughts and opinions are, I'm not asking you to summarize any of these works. I know what happened in these books. Hopefully you will read so you will know what happened in these books. And so I'm not looking for summary when I ask you to reflect on a saying or a quote from the book. I'm looking for you to think about it, think about the meaning of it, and present your perspective or point of view. And then also feel free to tie it in and connect it to things that we might see happening in the world around us currently. Okay, so that's the information for the core text. And then I'm going to also ask you to review again the plagiarism PowerPoint. I'm going to talk briefly about plagiarism in class during the lecture for Thursday in the brief time that we'll meet, but also make sure that you review the plagiarism slide and that you have a clear understanding of what plagiarism is, because whether you're doing a discussion board, a paper, or an exam response, you want to make sure that you avoid copying and pasting responses and things that you find on the internet to supply assignment information or complete assignments. It's plagiarism if you copy and paste. It's plagiarism if you copy and paste and change 2 words. It's plagiarism if you use somebody else's work from a previous class of mine or another class. It's technically plagiarism if you use your own work from another class without clearing it from a professor. So please make sure you have a good understanding of what plagiarism is so that you avoid it, whether we're talking about responding to questions about these books or when you have to do assignments, written assignments and papers for the class. All right, so that concludes our lecture part, and I hope that you enjoy these books as we study them in the course.